All right, let's talk about property. We all have a pretty solid idea of what it is, right? But what if I told you the history of property isn't really a story of ownership, but a story of theft? In this explainer, we're going to unpack a pretty wild argument that the entire concept of property is built on this cycle of conquest that just gets cleaned up and made to look respectable by the law.
So, let's just start right there with that really basic question. What is property? I mean, before we jump into the deep end of its history, just take a second. Think about what that word even means to you. It feels like this bedrock of our society, but where did this whole idea even come from?
Well, the story we're usually told is a pretty noble one, right? You know the one. Property is the cornerstone of civilization. It's the fruit of your labor, the thing that guarantees your liberty and your rights. That's the official story, the one that sounds really, really good. But the argument we're digging into today, it pushes back hard with a much, much darker take. It says property is just what's left over after a conquest, wiped clean by the law. That is a heavy statement. So let's get into the evidence and see what's behind it. Okay, so that brings us to our first big idea, the journey from sword to deed. The argument is actually pretty simple. The way land gets taken has definitely evolved over the centuries, from brute force to fancy paperwork. But the core act, the dispossession, that has been a constant theme all through history.
And you can see this pattern play out over and over again. I mean, look at this. It kicks off with the raw violence of Viking raiders back in 793. Then you jump forward a few centuries to 1066. The Normans, who are basically descendants of those same Vikings, conquer England and make land seizure official with the whole feudal system. And then, fast forward again to the 1700s, and the violence gets quieter. It gets bureaucratic. Now you've got the Enclosure Movement, using acts of Parliament to do pretty much the same thing. Take land from everybody else and give it to a select few.
And this quote, man, it just nails the whole idea. The sword clears the land, but it is the deed that keeps it. Think about that. The violence gets you the land in the first place, but it's the piece of paper, the law, that lets you hold on to it forever. The law isn't stopping the theft. It's providing the perfect alibi. So how did this actually happen? How do you turn outright theft into a legitimate legal title? Well, that's what we're looking at next. The specific weapons the state used, the actual legal machinery they built to make it all happen.
And the biggest weapon in their arsenal was something called the Enclosure Movement. See, for centuries, life in the countryside revolved around these shared lands, the commons. This is where you'd graze your animals, gather firewood, basically everything you needed to survive. Enclosure was the legal process of just fencing it all off, wiping out those ancient communal rights and turning it all into someone's private property. And we're not talking about a small policy tweak here. The scale of this was absolutely massive. I mean, look at this number. Between 1604 and 1914, the British Parliament passed over 5,000 of these Enclosure Acts. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign, driven by the state, to privatize the country, literally one village at a time. And of course, the whole process was designed to look perfectly legal and above board. You pass an official act of parliament, you appoint some commissioners to go divide up the land, and then, poof, communal rights are legally extinguished. You take this living, breathing, shared ecosystem and just carve it up into a neat grade of private parcels, all totally legal.
Okay, so you can imagine this had a huge human cost, right? I mean, what happened to the millions of people who suddenly lost access to the land they needed to live? Well, the law wasn't done with them yet. Now it was time to manage and control this new landless population.
This right here is just incredible. It shows how things people had done for generations, just basic survival, were turned into crimes overnight. You used to be able to glean leftover grain after the harvest. Now, that's theft. You needed firewood to stay warm? Sorry, that's trespassing now. See, the law didn't just take their land. It made their entire way of life illegal. It criminalized their memory.
So now you've got this huge, landless population. The state needs to control them, right? They need a workforce. The answer? Vagrancy laws. These laws literally made it a crime to not have a job, or you'd just be wandering around. And some of them were unbelievably brutal, like the 1547 Act that ordered people to be branded with hot irons, even enslaved. The point here is, these laws weren't a response to some new wave of crime. They were inventing a social danger to justify cracking down on the poor. The historian E.P. Thompson just sums up this whole psychological shift perfectly. He said the real crime wasn't actually taking something, it was the refusal to accept the new rules. It was the defiance of not recognizing that the world had changed, that the old ways were gone, and that everything now belonged to someone else.
Which brings us to the final, and maybe the most crucial piece of this whole argument. How does a system like this stick around? It's not just about police and punishment. It's about ideology. The law doesn't just do things. It teaches us how to think about property in the first place.
Yeah, this is the real power of the law. It has two jobs. One job is obvious. It enforces property rights with courts and police. But its other job, the more important one, is to hide its own history, to obscure where it all came from. The law makes the way things are now seem totally natural, totally fair, and it does a great job of sweeping that messy history of conquest right under the rug.
So how does it pull this off? Well, it's a multi-pronged attack. First, it gets moral about it. The rich people with land, oh, they're productive. The poor people without it, they must be irresponsible or lazy. Then it reframes the whole story. We don't talk about the spear anymore. We only talk about the deed. It uses fancy philosophy, too. Think John Locke, who argued that if you mixed your labor with something, it becomes yours. A very handy idea if you want to take land from, say, indigenous people you've decided are idle. And of course, it bakes privilege right into the legal code, historically tying the right to own property to things like race and social class.
And this quote just puts a perfect bow on it. The law becomes the best mask for theft because it teaches us not to even see the theft. The real genius of the system isn't punishing thieves. It's redefining theft so completely that the biggest theft of all, the one everything is built on, becomes completely invisible.
So when you boil it all down, the main claim is this. The state isn't some neutral referee just protecting people's stuff. No, it's the one that creates the very idea of property in the first place. It writes the rule book, it defines who gets to own what, and it's a master at turning a bloody history of violence into a nice, clean story about virtue and law and order.
And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If this whole historical argument holds water, if law really is the alibi for the past, then what is it an alibi for today? What arrangements is it making look normal and fair right now? And maybe most importantly, what kinds of theft is it teaching us not to see?